There is a place at the forefront of modern geopolitical tensions that goes unreported despite the major threat to global security it poses. A place trapped between three nuclear powers, all vying for control and influence over its land. A place whose people would prefer independence, but whose history has been filled with militarism, subjugation, and violence. Today we're going to take you on a journey to a slice of Himalayan paradise that, in its millennia-long history, has never been more politically consequential than today. Why are the countries involved fighting over it? Why does a global superpower skulking in the periphery mean bad news for everyone involved? And who are the everyday people caught in the middle of this geopolitical tough love triangle? This is the place where independence might be impossible, the place where idealistic dreams are crushed under the boot of realpolitik, the place worth dying for, the place worth killing for, stranded at the top of the world. Kashmir. It's August of 2019, and former US Secretary of State Mike Pompeo is having a weird day. He's in Hanoi, negotiating with North Korea over nuclear weapons. His day, however, is about to take a turn for the worse. Before he knows it, a crisis in a different part of Asia nearly escalates to full-blown nuclear war as Pakistan and India both consider the big red button. A year later, in June of 2020, Chinese and Indian troops are on a remote mountain plateau, beating each other to death with iron rods. So to use a technical term here, what the hell is going on? The region at the heart of both of these events is Kashmir, a starkly beautiful landscape that sits thousands of meters above sea level. Yet Kashmir is more than just a source of spectacular Instagram photos. It's a bitterly contested region, one where three nuclear-armed powers have spent decades battling for influence. And while the roots of this three-way conflict can be traced back centuries, for our purposes today, we are focusing on the modern era. Specifically, the era that began with one of South Asia's bloodiest tragedies, the partition of British India. Our story begins in 1947. The sun was setting on the British Empire, who were in the midst of a partition of the Indian subcontinent orchestrated in less than 6 weeks. As the British hightailed it out of what was British India, the brand new nations of India and Pakistan were born. The newly formed nations, one majority Hindu, the other majority Muslim, went to war less than 3 months later. The British crumpets in the toaster had barely gone cold, and both countries had already descended into violence. But why? Well, in short, because of Kashmir. The leader of the Kashmiri people during the British reign hesitated when prompted to join the new nation of Pakistan. Now, don't get us wrong, Kashmir is majority Muslim, with a 1947 British census placing the region as 77% Muslim. From a religious perspective, it made sense for Kashmir to want to join Pakistan. However, the Kashmiri leader, a man known as Hari Singh, wanted Kashmir to be an independent state. When he hesitated, Pakistan struck into Kashmir, seizing much of its territory. Singh then pleaded Kashmir's fealty to India in return for military assistance and a degree of semi-autonomy. And military assistance is exactly what he got. India drove Pakistan out of Kashmir in a decisive victory. However, what seems like divine intervention would soon start to look like a Faustian bargain. Now that India had Kashmir, it was not going to let go. The agreement for Kashmir to become a semi-autonomous part of India would become the source of India's claims to the entire region, claims New Delhi maintains to this day. The UN wanted a referendum for the Kashmiri people to choose which nation to join, although independence was not an option. This referendum never happened, owing to both nations still fighting at the time, although a ceasefire line would be established in 1948. The UN call for a referendum is the basis for Pakistani claims over Kashmir, as if, given the choice, the overwhelmingly Muslim Kashmir would likely choose Pakistan. New Delhi, however, keen to hold on to its new region, struck a deal with Kashmir, ratifying Article 370 of the Indian Constitution in 1949, establishing a special status in the region and, most importantly, semi-autonomy. Fast forward to the 1960s, and both nations went to war over Kashmir and butted heads yet again in the 70s. Over 10,000 perished during various incursions, strikes, skirmishes, and wars on both sides. A series of wars that would only finally get some respite with the 1972 similar agreement. Signed in the wake of an Indian victory, the agreement pledged communication and diplomacy over future conflict, established the ceasefire line as an unofficial border known as the Line of Control, and aimed to find an ultimate resolution to the Kashmir issue. The similar agreement would form the basis of Pakistani-Indian relations going forward, not that those relations would in any way benefit the region itself, mind you. This is the era when Kashmir was unofficially divided into what's known internationally as India-administered Kashmir and Pakistan-administered Kashmir. India-administered Kashmir refers to the states of Jammu and Kashmir as well as Ladakh, while Pakistan administers Gilgit-Baltistan. We'll be referring a lot to the Indian-administered territory in this portion of the video, as it's much larger than the Pakistani-administered territory. It's also where the majority of the biggest events around Kashmir happened in the decades following the Simla Agreement. As those events would show, agreements over Kashmir rarely last. The 1980s saw the start of a decades-long insurgency in Kashmir that is still ongoing today, having claimed thousands of lives through guerrilla warfare. The ever-present cycle of militant violence, civilian protests, and brutal subjugation of the region ensued in the following years. As to who was responsible for this bloodshed, well, that's where things descend into the blame game. India has always blamed Pakistan for arming the insurgents and stoking the conflict. According to Human Rights Watch, the majority of the insurgents were recruited from the local population of Pakistani Kashmiris who supported the region's struggle for independence. Pakistanis from elsewhere in Pakistan drawn into the conflict for ideological reasons, and even foreign militants from elsewhere in the Middle East. Given what we know about Pakistan's arming insurgencies, it would not be impossible to believe that this was also happening in Kashmir. Much of Kashmir, like the landscape in other nations where guerrilla warfare is utilized, is highly mountainous, from where it's difficult to dislodge an insurgency without significant bloodshed. Pakistan and India would go to war again in 1999, all the while both nations arguing over Kashmir and the insurgency, with regular Kashmiris caught in the middle. From here, tensions cooled but remained uneasy. The 2000s and early 2010s saw a lot of protests in the region, most of which India brutally put down. There were occasional flare-ups on the line of control, but nothing major. And it would have stayed that way if not for a highly controversial decision by India in 2019. A decision that may end up being the most politically consequential one in all of Kashmiri history. In the summer of 2019, Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi, in line with his re-election campaign promise, repealed Article 370 of the Indian Constitution, revoking Indian-administered Kashmir's semi-autonomy and its special status. The region had now officially been federated into India. The region's absorption into the Indian political system was highly controversial in Kashmir itself, but lauded in other parts of the country. However, it was understandably not as popular abroad. Pakistan lays claim to the entirety of Indian-administered Kashmir, so that area, being federated into its largest rival's political system, was viewed as a huge step over the line. Islamabad was furious, branding the move as illegal, but it didn't stop there. Pakistan suspended all trade with India, with NBC reporting an official downgrade in diplomatic ties between the two countries. Following the announcement, tensions reached boiling point again after India struck against militants in Pakistani territory, whilst Islamabad shot down an Indian jet and captured its pilot. Former Pakistani Prime Minister Imran Khan had this to say about the incident, quoting him here: "Our action is just to let them know that just like they intruded into our territory, we are also capable of going into their territory," warning that further escalation could spiral out of control. Mike Pompeo witnessed this firsthand, as poor communications between both countries saw both sides stray towards nuclear escalation. The former Secretary of State's story can be partially corroborated, with Pakistani officials at the time publicly stating Islamabad would, quote, "exercise all possible options over Kashmir." Meanwhile, India threatened to completely isolate Pakistan from the international community. Thanks to diplomatic crisis talks and de-escalation measures set in motion by the USA, the world did not go to nuclear war in 2019. By 2021, tensions had eased enough between Pakistan and India to agree again to another ceasefire at the line of control. A fragile peace settled over the landscape. That 2021 ceasefire was, to date, the last time that India and Pakistan saw conflict over Kashmir. However, India and Pakistan are not the only ones fighting over Kashmir. For decades, another player has been working on the periphery, skulking in the shadows and making gains. That player is the People's Republic of China. China's stance over Kashmir has largely been to keep to the shadows and slowly consolidate territory over time. However, on some occasions, Beijing's ambitions have been brought into the open. Whilst India was escalating tensions with Pakistan in the 1960s, it was actively in conflict with Mao's China, going to war over the Kashmiri region of Aksai Chin. China had already liberated Tibet in the 1950s, and adding Aksai Chin would connect its westernmost territories. Given China now administers the region, you can probably guess who won that particular war. Today, Beijing officially only claims the land of Kashmir that it already owns, although there have been disputes between India and China over who should control parts of Ladakh. Here too, there is a line of control known as the line of actual control. The line of actual control creates a relatively flat and easily defensible border with India, allowing Beijing to protect manufacturing hubs in the western part of China. Much of Kashmir sits on the Tibetan plateau, and having access to such a mountainous region gives anyone who can hold it a distinct military advantage over those who do not. This may go some way to explaining Chinese interest in the region. After the war with India, China persuaded the Pakistani government to cede the Trans-Karakoram Tract to Beijing in 1963, much to New Delhi's anger. The Trans-Karakoram Tract connects mainland China to Pakistan-administered Kashmir through Gilgit-Baltistan. India claims the tract in accordance with its total claim of Kashmir, whilst China administers it. The China-Pakistan Economic Corridor, part of China's Belt and Road Initiative, also connects China to Pakistan through Kashmir. Practically speaking, China having access to the Trans-Karakoram Tract makes this easier while legitimizing both Pakistan and China's claims through their international cooperation. The 1963 agreement would be the last we would really see of China in Kashmir for a number of decades until the 1990s, when China began to probe around the line of actual control again. Both China and India would build up significant security and surveillance infrastructure across the de facto border. It seemed that both superpowers would soon be at war over Kashmir again. However, cooler heads prevailed, recognizing that escalation could lead to war with many dead. Both sides agreed to talks, signing a number of agreements throughout the decade to de-escalate around the line of actual control. One of those agreements called for no military exercises to be conducted near the line, with another barring the use of firearms in the region. Whilst the late 90s saw more tension as India conducted a nuclear test in May of 1998, both nations coerced each other into a fragile but long-lasting peace only ever permeated by minor skirmishes. However, the 2019 repealing of Article 370 really didn't impress Beijing. According to the diplomat, Beijing was concerned that India was undermining its territorial sovereignty. The following year, in 2020, both nations' soldiers were patrolling on or near the line of actual control when they came to blows. Owing to the no firearms rule, all the soldiers had to arm themselves with crude metal rods. However, the Iron Age weaponry didn't stop both sets of soldiers, who then used them to beat each other to a pulp. The Great Bludgeoning must have been one of the only solely hand-to-hand combat engagements between two nations in the 21st century. But just because no bullets were fired doesn't mean that it was any less deadly. The skirmish, which the BBC reports saw the deaths of 4 Chinese and 20 Indian soldiers respectively, represented a significant downturn in relations between the two nations. This was followed in 2022 by a 2-day standoff at an undetermined location on the line of actual control. So whilst China had been dormant for some time over Kashmir, slowly probing and quietly consolidating, it appears that 2019 was the catalyst for the escalation that we've seen since. And now, much like with India and Pakistan, there is an uneasy tension between both countries and a fragile peace to match, but it is unlikely to last for long. As China's next big rival, likely to reach superpower status, Beijing's probing into Indian-administered Kashmir in the 2020s, alongside its cooperation with India's fiercest rival in Pakistan, says a lot about how much China sees India as a future threat. It may also suggest that Beijing is not fully content with the buffer zone it has so far, potentially paving the way for future conflict. But why do these nations have such opposed claims of Kashmir? Why have India, China, and Pakistan spent the better part of a century fighting over this territory? Could it really be that this territory is religiously and culturally significant to all three nations? Or is there something more at play here? To call Kashmir and the geopolitical quagmire of claims surrounding it complex would be like saying Bruce Lee was merely a decent martial artist, an understatement so large that it strays into error. As such, we're not even going to try to give a definitive overview. All we're going to do is give you the basics as objectively as possible and let you make up your minds. But just know that each of the 3 countries involved have very firm opinions on the validity of their claims, almost entirely disregarding the other 2 views. Since India has the most de facto control over Kashmir Kashmir, we'll start there. India uses historical context and a legal justification in order to back up its claim to Kashmir. At the point of accession in 1947, the Kashmiri Maharaja aligned the region with India in exchange for military assistance. Legally, this might not be enough to consider Kashmir a part of India today. However, Kashmir's constitution defining it as a part of India in 1957, the 1951 regional elections, and the 1953 ratification of the accession to India provide a strong legal framework that India is able to use to back its claim. No matter what anybody else says, India considers Kashmir part of India. This is so much the case that India refers to everything that happens within Kashmir as an internal matter, outright disregarding Chinese and Pakistani claims to the region. As such, India finds issue with the Chinese-Pakistani relations and decisions over their respective portions of Kashmir. Similarly, Pakistan and China both collaborate over Kashmir in order to snub India. When the Indian portion of Kashmir was split into two regions and subsumed into the Indian political system in 2019, India used this controversial decision as further proof that Kashmir was in fact Indian. They also had the receipts to prove it when the Indian Supreme Court upheld the decision in 2023. The encouragement of elections in Indian-administered Kashmir by the Indian government is used to create the appearance of a happy region engaging in a peaceful democratic process. However, the decision to bifurcate the region in 2019 was anything but democratic. The AP reports that the decision was accompanied by an unprecedented security crackdown. There was a complete communications blackout, and local residents were put on lockdown for 5 days before India repealed Article 370. The Guardian reports that landline phones and cable TV were cut off and a strict curfew was imposed, all during peacetime. As for the opinions of these locals, well, the AP reports that they viewed the decision as more of an annexation than an integration into the Indian political system. Kashmir's top pro-Indian politician, Omar Abdullah, even told the publication in 2023 that democracy stops where the boundaries of Jammu and Kashmir begin. Kashmiris told the AP that the laws enacted upon them were designed to change the demography of the area, examples being controversial settler laws and gerrymandering, which could alter the results of a referendum or elections down the line. Modi himself has stated that revoking Article 370 corrected a historic blunder, but the ongoing insurgency proves that the Kashmiris will not go quietly. As Omar Abdullah said when talking about parts of Kashmir that did not want to join India, that constituency needs to be taken into account. It doesn't just miraculously disappear. Next up, you have Pakistan's claim to Kashmir, which is built on an internationally recognized framework of democracy and self-determination. On Kashmir, Islamabad refers back to UN Security Council Resolution 47. This was the 1948 resolution calling for a referendum to determine the region's future. As an agreement could not be found at the time, Pakistan maintains that it is the correct way to resolve the dispute. Naturally, Pakistan peddles this narrative as they would likely be the beneficiaries of said referendum's results owing to the demography of the region, especially if independence wasn't on the ballot. The British census in 1947 told us that Kashmir was 77% Muslim, although today that figure sits around 68% according to Al Jazeera. Either way, that is enough to win any referendum. In effect, Pakistan could preach democracy over the Kashmir issue because it looks good on the international stage, whilst Islamabad can all but guarantee the results. It is a very strong position to hold at the negotiating table. Although Pakistan's arming terrorists to fuel the insurgency in Kashmir does weaken its position somewhat, does Pakistan really want a peaceful and democratic solution? Their words would suggest so, but their actions, maybe not. Pakistan is using its position as the apparent underdog in this situation to its full advantage, emphasizing and insisting on dialogue and negotiation to end the dispute. This, by comparison to India's militaristic and hardline approach, internationally casts Pakistan in a more reasonable light on Kashmir. Pakistan adds fuel to the fire for India by rightly raising concerns around human rights issues in the Indian-administered portion, which NGOs like Amnesty International report on extensively, although war crimes and crimes against humanity have been documented as originating from both sides of the line of control. Pakistan's goal is simple: preach open dialogue in the international community and continue to recommend a referendum in the hopes of building international pressure on India. Ideally, though, they'd do that without backing armed militants. If Pakistan continues to play the insurgency game, they might lose the chance of winning their ultimate prize. And then there's China. China is an unusual case in Kashmir, as, unlike India and Pakistan, it does not lay claim to the entire region. Because of this, international organizations have tended to view Kashmir as a bilateral issue between New Delhi and Islamabad, relegating Beijing to an interesting sideshow. In reality, though, China's strategic goals may be equally expansive, with far greater economic and military capability to boot. Make no mistake, China is a major player in every theater it enters. This is no different. We've simply yet to see the tensions boil over to such an extent that it leads to a protracted conflict. As to why that might be, well, there are theories. As one of the two strongest economies on Earth, China has a vested interest in maintaining the currently functioning international order. For China to go to war over Kashmir, the expected gains would have to outweigh upending that same international order. That's a risk Beijing would have to consider very carefully. So for now, China mostly stakes a claim on the territory that it already de facto controls in Aksai Chin and the Trans-Karakoram Tract. Similarly, China may have some claims to the more Buddhist areas of Kashmir from a cultural and religious perspective. Areas of Ladakh and Aksai China house large numbers of Buddhists, similar to its neighbor Tibet. Given Chinese treatment of Tibet, you wouldn't expect Beijing to treat Buddhist areas with any real reverence, but that doesn't stop them from claiming the region. Although, with the prevalence of Muslims in Xinjiang, the fact that China has not also claimed more of the Islamic areas of Kashmir, especially where its border meets Pakistan, tells us that there is more to their reasoning than religion alone. Ultimately, however, China remains elusive in its goals. Overall, China likely sees Kashmir in a more strategic light and therefore may continue to probe around the borders if it believes it can deprive the other powers of the advantage that the Tibetan Plateau provides. Similarly, geopolitically speaking, China aims to dominate and suffocate its enemies, so establishing who is quite literally on top of the world may symbolically be important to Beijing. So, that's where things stand today with Kashmir, a stunning slice of mountain landscape that may yet become a global crisis point. However, we still have a couple of questions that we need to answer. What might this mean for the future, and what of the Kashmiris themselves? Kashmir's legacy is complicated. Throughout its history, Kashmir has slowly become an epicenter of conflict between states, empires, and militants. Its legacy is one of violence, with the Kashmiri people caught in the middle and stuck for decades in a geopolitical quagmire, trapped between three nation-states, all vying for power, all with varying influence, and all willing to use violence to further their goals. Instability and danger have led to drops in investment and tourism. Many Kashmiris today live in poverty. This puts the people in a position where they are unable to facilitate change for their home. Worse still, violence is used by those nations to keep it that way. The police state that has descended over especially Indian-administered Kashmir has severely curtailed the civil liberties of, by India's definition, its own citizens. 2019 was not the only enforced curfew, with trial runs occurring in the years prior. Checkpoints are ubiquitous, as is police violence towards protesters. 2016 saw the Indian authorities use pellet shotguns to dispel demonstrators that, according to The Guardian, partially or permanently blinded almost 1,000 people, including children. Human rights organizations have reported that widespread abuses have occurred in Kashmir, from extrajudicial killing, torture, and arbitrary detention to the 8,000 civilians who simply disappeared. The human rights crisis in Kashmir is ongoing. A 2009 foreign policy feature revealed that 2,700 unmarked graves were found alongside over 2,900 bodies close to the line of control. What's more, the Indian police designated the bodies as foreign terrorists in their paperwork. When the government was caught out in the lie, it gave the bodies back quietly, stating that they had returned the foreign militants to their villages. It is a sobering reminder of the real politic that dominates in Kashmir. To paraphrase Machiavelli, the nations around Kashmir do as they will, whilst the Kashmiris will suffer what they must. The violent legacy bleeds into potential future conflicts. India's Supreme Court backed the decision to incorporate Indian-administered Kashmir, with ensuing escalation confirming that Pakistan and China, to put it mildly, were not impressed. The fragile state of peace on the de facto borders of Kashmir only heightens tensions, and all three nations seem unhappy with their respective portions of the region. It's clear that there is a bargaining friction alongside a substantive disagreement over the allegiance of Kashmir, which could push the nations to war. There is some good news here, though. As the nations are currently not at war and are able to hold their territory without starting one, that means there is space for bargaining, for an uneasy peace. War, after all, is paid for in lives and treasure. Giving up a portion of Kashmir to preserve peace is in everybody's interests. The fact that all three nations can agree to that, at least in theory, is a good thing. The bad news, however, is that future considerations must also be taken into account. China's population is declining, having peaked in 2020 at 1.43 billion. India has officially overtaken it and is not slowing down anytime soon. With a higher population comes more soldiers. By 2100, India could have almost 1 billion more people than China, according to the French Institute for Demographic Studies. Such trajectories could push China to act now if Beijing perceives that acting later would end poorly. China's window is limited, and there will be motivation for Beijing to act before it's too late. The nature of warfare is also changing. For example, the usage rights for the Indus River, which feeds waterways throughout the subcontinent, has its origins in Kashmir. If water becomes an ever more highly sought resource, it could further complicate an already complex and fragile peace. On top of all that is the looming specter of a nuclear disaster. As Mike Pompeo saw in 2019, Kashmir now has a track record with nuclear escalation. Between China, India, and Pakistan, there are over 800 nuclear warheads, more than would be enough to destroy all three countries many times over. As India continues to be brash, as Pakistan fuels the crises, as China continues to probe, any conflict that breaks out pushes all three closer to nuclear annihilation. Or does it? Despite being the meat in a three-sided uranium sandwich and the narrative of an imminent nuclear winter being fun to sink your teeth into, the truth is always a little harder to swallow. India and China both have a no first-use policy when it comes to nukes, hopefully guaranteeing they will not hit the button unless attacked first. However, it's hard to judge whether or not Modi or Xi's regime would consider unleashing Armageddon if they deemed that their territorial sovereignty was violated. The plasticity of Kashmir's borders creates an ambiguity that could cause rapid escalation. However, even if India or China's territory was violated, there is more evidence to suggest a traditional war would follow, not a nuclear one. Pakistan conversely promotes deterrence through mutually assured destruction and massive retaliation. This makes Pakistan the most likely to start a nuclear war of the three. Would Pakistan try to nuke India over Kashmir? We can't know for sure. The 2019 incident tells us Islamabad would at least consider it. However, Pakistan would be risking international pariah status and nuclear annihilation over a region that it could one day gain through democratic means. It's like blowing up your house to kill a wasp when you could just open the window. The stakes aren't high enough for Pakistan to consider the nuclear option over their robust diplomatic claim. Rest assured, whilst a potential flashpoint for future conflict, a lot of things would have to go wrong before a Kashmiri crisis went nuclear. As we saw in 2019, a lot of things can indeed go wrong. However, 2019 also showed that crisis talks and de-escalation works. After all, neither Pakistan nor India today is a radioactive wasteland. So where does that all leave us? It leaves Kashmir as one of the most striking examples of realpolitik in the modern world. Kashmir's legacy has always been bigger than itself. It is defined by the nations around it, and those nations aren't going to let go. So what happens from here? Well, your guess is as good as ours. Kashmir may be a staging ground for further conflict, but whether that conflict ultimately breaks out and between who remains to be seen. What's clear is that Kashmir is defined by volatility, fragility, and instability, none of which are good for long-lasting peace. As India enters its prime, as China peaks, as Pakistan continues to sow conflict, and as the landscape changes, any number of decisions could alter Asia forever. And the likelihood is the Kashmiri people will continue to suffer for that. There is clearly more of the story yet to come. It might not be today, it might not be tomorrow, but Kashmir may one day be thrust into the spotlight again, given importance that it never asked for. Let's hope that if that day does come, cooler heads prevail again. After all, in Kashmir, much like in the sheer Himalayan cliffs that make up its landscape, all it takes is one little push.